Hello and welcome to this video, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the prog band Genesis. I'm going to be giving you my favourite album by Genesis and coming up with a couple of runner-ups too, but also talking about the band and talking about prog. On this channel I talk a lot about jazz and jazz fusion, but I am also a big progressive rock fan, and some of you may know that I am the drummer in the progressive rock band Rain, that I've played in Frost, and I've also played in IQ. IQ, of course, a very Genesis influenced progressive rock band, so a lot of the fans of IQ are also fans of Genesis, particularly early Genesis, the Peter Gabriel era. Now this is one of the big debates that comes up with Genesis, which is around what is proper Genesis. So the prog Genesis fans love the Gabriel era. They're quite fond of Trick and the Tail. They can just about stomach and then there were three, but after that they start to find it very difficult, and there's always some sort of cut off point where they no longer feel that they can support the band. There's some fans who love every bit of it, and of course there's millions and millions of Genesis fans who aren't really aware of the early 70s prog stuff and are fans of the huge hit records they had in the 80s. I really want to talk about that on this video, but first let's get into discussing my favourite albums. Now, before we get on, if I sound a little bit croaky, it's because I have COVID at the moment, and I'm in the last few days. I think in 2 days I'm allowed to get back out the house. It's been pretty rough. I've been pretty ill, that's why there's been no videos. And I might be a bit spongy in my thinking. I'm trying to really focus and get this video done, but if you would notice any of those things, it is because I have had the COVID and it is pretty rough. Anyway, let's soldier on, and hopefully the power of prog and Genesis will make us all feel a lot better. So let's deal with my favourite Genesis albums, and I'll tell you my favourite Genesis album. Let's start with that first. Well, my love of prog is pre my love of jazz. Although I grew up listening to jazz as a kid, the music I discovered first myself was new wave of British heavy metal, and that led me to Led Zeppelin, classic rock, and from then I went to bands like Yes, and Pink Floyd and Genesis. I was very young when I first started listening to Genesis. Of course, Genesis were also in the charts at that time. Phil Collins was in the charts, so it was a weird thing, to discover there was this sort of classic 70s rock band called Genesis that was also contained the guy that was doing things like You Can't Hurry Love and all that stuff that was in the charts at that time. So I went and bought a couple of Genesis albums to find out what they were like, and that really colours my choices. So this is a really subjective top 10, and I'm sure it won't match up with what the general consensus is, but it'd be an interesting talk, I think. So my third favourite Genesis album, there's a part of me that wants to put these two at number one, but my third favourite Genesis album is the first Genesis album I bought, and it is this one, Three Sides Live. Now, I absolutely love this. At the time this came out, a few years later, they brought a sort of film out of the tour, and I managed to see that on the TV, and I was really impressed by that. I think the fact that this is for the first Genesis album I ever heard, what it did is it gave me a love of the whole lot, right? It gave me a love of the proggy stuff, and also things like Turn It On Again, Abacab, those tracks I absolutely loved, and I didn't differentiate between those two tunes, those two styles. I just didn't differentiate at all. To me, there was a Genesis sound, and that sound was contained within both. There was a way Phil Collins played drums, there was a groove to it, there was an interest in the timings, that proggy thing that's there on the early stuff. I could also hear it in Abacab and Turn It On. I didn't differentiate between the two. So what this was for me was an incredible overview of what they did. Well, let's go through the tracks. On side one, it starts off with Turn It On Again, Dodo and Abacab, which are three incredible pop songs, which they are, The side two then had Behind the Lines, The Duchess, Me and Sarah Jane, Follow You, Follow Me. So the first album is the Genesis sound, it's that poppy sound. It's the sound that many proggy Genesis fans object to. You know, where I think their argument is that they sold out at this point. They started to, you know, create sort of vacuous pop music. I really don't think that's the case. On side 3 we have Misunderstanding, which is one of their most poppiest songs, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But then it changes, and we have the In the Cage medley, followed by Afterglow. This was my introduction to proggy Genesis. That's where it was, and for me that is one of the great moments in prog. I didn't perceive that this was sort of a medley. I didn't understand that. To me, this was one track. It was one of the first times I'd heard a rock band playing a long form tracking anyway whatsoever, and I thought it was absolutely incredible. It still astonishes me now listening to it that they are actually able to, out of a medley, create something that's so compositionally coherent. And then on side 4 we have full on prog, with even Bill Bruford turning up, One for the Vine, Fountain of Salmacis, and Watcher of the Skies. That's where my introduction to prog Genesis was. But the thing about Genesis, and I'm going to do another video to deal with this, I'm going to really talk about this prog snobbery. I think there's many people out there that think that Genesis, the old Genesis, is fantastic because it's hard, because the musicianship is really what they think is really virtuoso, that the compositions are really complex, and they think that complexity gives it its worth. I don't think it does. I think the thing that makes Genesis great is the signature sound of Genesis. It's the sound of all the elements together. They have a way of voicing chords. They have a way of dropping grooves and using riffs. They have a way of using very English themes and winding those in with English accents, but mixed with sort of jazz and very quite funky grooves. All that for me is what I love about Genesis. So when I hear the pop stuff, that is the flip coin of what I can hear when I listen to the early Genesis albums. And so I took it all in together. And I think this is a theme I really want to talk about, you know, because I'm going to be doing more videos on prog, I think, on this channel this year. And I really want to sort of stick the knife, to use a Genesis reference there, stick the knife in this idea of the prog snobbery, you know, and sort of show it up, because it's basically not true. It's just not the case. If you're measuring bands on their virtuoso level, well, you will find a virtuosity equal to Genesis in all sorts of different music. It's just perhaps that you don't know enough about music to be able to recognise it. And that's often the thing I think that happens where people aren't listening. They're not listening to the fact that when you listen to something like Abacab or Turn It On Again, that the piano techniques that you know, Tony Banks is using in that song are the same ones that he uses on Lamb Lies Down. You know, the grooves are in odd time signatures, just like Lamb Lies Down. So all it is the fact that Phil Collins is singing, and the fact that the song doesn't flow on and isn't conceptual. That's the only real difference. And I think it's surprising that people can't spot that and are listening to such shallow generic differences. So anyway, so that would be my third favourite Genesis album, and I'd love to keep that. I think if I'm going to keep one Genesis album, I'd have this, because, as I said, it holds a place in my heart as being the album where I discovered Genesis, and it really represents both sides of what they do, and I do love both. Right, so what am I going to put in at number 2 on the list of my favourite Genesis albums? Well, it was going to be number 1, but I decided to go with my heart and put the one that I really would keep, the one I would stick at number 1. So at number 2 we have Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. This is an absolute masterpiece. You know, it's probably one of the greatest progressive rock albums ever made. It's really interesting in that it turns away from that English aesthetic that you get in Genesis and a lot of other prog bands, and it brings in something which is a lot more American. Of course, America was never very good at doing prog, you know. Sorry. Yeah, Kansas were good. Rush really good, but they're Canadian. Styx, yeah. That's about it, you know. sure people will be shouting other prog bands, but nothing to compare with Yes, Genesis, Pink Floyd, Gentle Giant, Van de Graaff Generator. Nothing could go. I can just go on, and I think that one of the things is because prog is essentially that type of prog, because you've got all the European prog as well, but that type of prog is very is very grounded in an English aesthetic, and I've done a lot of videos on this. This is really interesting because it isn't. It's grounded in American aesthetic. This points the finger that how American prog could have been if they'd have worked a way out of making their own prog and not copying, British prog bands. This is an absolute masterpiece, right? So, why is it not my number one? Well, there seems to be, I would say, a number of phases of Genesis, not two, but a number of phases. There's the early Genesis, the pre-Phil Collins, Steve Hackett Genesis, which I haven't got that much interest in. The first album is obviously an anomaly. The second album, Trespass, has got moments, but you're really hearing bits of the Genesis sound. It's not quite there. The Knife, as we've said, is probably a classic Genesis song. It's the acquisition of Phil Collins and Steve Hackett into the band that makes Genesis. And as soon as that happens, the magic happens. There's just this magical thing that goes way beyond what they were thinking, I think. It's the elements coming together. And they make a series of albums. All those albums are absolute classic prog albums. And they develop the sound as they go. I would say Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is the summit of that progression. And because of that, it's slightly different from classic Genesis for me. It's not quite like Foxtrot or Selling England by the Pound. It's not quite like that. It's slightly different. After Gabriel goes, there's a last gasp while Hackett's in the band, and they do some incredible prog, absolutely amazing stuff. But you feel that it's slowly waning away now. So we've reached the summit and we're going down the other side, and they move their skills towards making more pop music. Now, if they don't, I think, make pop music in the same way as Michael Jackson makes pop music or Madonna, what they do is they take what they do and they rein it in. And this is the big problem I had against this sort of prog snobs who don't like the later Genesis. When punk happened, the prog musicians either died away, like ELP, because they just didn't understand it, or if there was any worth to what they were doing, they draw it in. Now in Genesis and Phil Collins and Peter Gabriel's case, in drawing it in, they became some of the biggest pop acts in the world. Now there's a reason for this. It's because the pop music of the 1980s, which was all encompassing, right, did not have its roots in punk. It had its roots in prog. Kate Bush, The Police, Genesis, Phil Collins, and then the new romantic bands like ABC and the stuff Trevor Horn produced, and then Yes coming back and having hit records. It was progressive rock ideas pulled in that created some of the greatest pop music in the world. And if prog could actually accept that lineage and put its hands up and say, yeah, this is what prog did, look everybody, look at the things we did, then this wouldn't seem like a marginalised form. But it's a marginalised form because the prog snobs who cannot let go, of what happened in 1973, they can't let go of it, want to reject everything that comes after it. It's a rejection of that stuff. Progressive rock. Why didn't we like it? Why don't we like this later Genesis? Oh, because they progressed. That was the last thing they should have done. Right? This is the peak of the progression. This is the top of the mountain. But it's still not my favourite Genesis album. My favourite Genesis album of all the albums would be this one. Nursery Crime. Right, for me, there's something about this album that the other albums haven't got. And I went looking for it, I bought Foxtrot as a kid. I bought Selling England by the Pound. And those albums seem to be doing what was on this, but never in the way that happens on this album. This is a completely personal viewpoint, because Foxtrot's absolutely incredible. Supper's Ready is just absolutely brilliant. But this one, I think it's the artwork. I think it's this sort of inner, sort of Edwardian scrapbook look here. This is an incredible thing to have in a rock band. And I think the sort of epics on here, Return of the Giant Hodwig, you know, Fountain of Salmantis and Musical Box, those for me, that is the great, they're the great Genesis tracks. Phil Collins just seems to be absolutely inspired coming into this band, and he's a funky, groovy soul bass player, and I think that's something that really comes in, you know, and Hackett as well. You know, I think that guitar playing on Hogweed, you know, which is, where he's tapping the guitar, you know, you've never heard anything like this in your life. All of those sounds coming in at once and just igniting the band and making it so exciting. This has always been for me the album that really defines that prog sound, not just Genesis sound, but prog sound. And this is my favourite Genesis album. Of course, this is all you know, subjective. You know, if I was standing outside myself, I would probably say that the album I would keep would be Lamb Lies Down. I would make that, you know, my favourite. But what is interesting in all this is the prog's audience and the way that they have defined what prog is. Of course, this started with the media. You know, I think when punk happened and the music press, which had loved prog but didn't quite understand it. You know, these bands were above the writers, the critics, and they never really liked that. So once they had a chance to be able to stick the knife in, they did. And I think that created a reaction in prog fans where they then dug their heels in. You know, and this has happened and gone on and been part of the story ever since. 45 years later, you know, it's still there. But I think we should celebrate Genesis actually for emerging in a scene and being able to create high-level rock music without resorting to blues and American cliches, which of course is a major problem if you're a British rock musician. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, how honest is it to stand up and sing about levees and Route 66 and all these things? You know, how honest is it for a British musician to do that? Rock music really is the reaction in terms of British rock bands, and of course, you know, if you name the greatest rock bands of all time, you're naming British rock bands. It's their reaction to the blues, which is important. You know, but Led Zeppelin and all, Cream and all this, it's their reaction to the blues. It's not blues, it's something else. It's blues shot through the sensibilities of middle class, you know, white male art students. That's where British rock comes from. And as soon as that happens, which is a fantastic thing and it creates great music, but where do you go with it? And I think certain musicians think about that and they solve it in their way. So, for example, you could have solved it like Chaz and Dave, you know. I mean, you could have taken sort of Jerry Lee Lewis, but made it into a form that's where you could sing Cockney songs and Cockney stories. That would be an example of how you solve it. Well, I think bands like Genesis also solved it in their own way, and then they took that very elitist arts education that they would have received at places like Chapter House, and were able to forge that into a rock music setting. Which is incredible, and that's what we hear when we hear those early albums. It's an incredible thing. It's very intellectual, very intelligent, and very moving. I love it. I absolutely love it. But how long can you go on for? And how do you take those ideas and how do you pull them in, you know, to a setting that's more commercial? And Genesis did that as well. Let's not deny them that. Let's celebrate the fact that these ideas ended up selling millions and millions of records and turning them into one of the biggest bands in the world. Let's celebrate that, because I think it's worth celebrating. Anyway, that's my video on Genesis. I'm sure there'll be a few more as we go on. I hope you liked it. If you want more prog, say, and I'll do more prog. I think I'm going to be doing a lot more prog this year. So again, thanks for listening. See you soon, and I'll see you on the next video. Thank you.